On June 18, 1815, the fate of Europe hung in the balance near the small village of Waterloo in present-day Belgium. A French army, led by the legendary Napoleon Bonaparte, faced off against a coalition of British, Dutch, Belgian, and German troops. The stakes could not have been higher. Napoleon, having recently returned from exile, sought to reclaim his dominance over Europe. His opponents, led by the Duke of Wellington and Gebhard Liebrecht von Blücher, were determined to crush Napoleon's ambitions once and for all. The Battle of Waterloo would become a pivotal moment in European history, marking the end of Napoleon's reign and ushering in a new era of peace and stability. The outcome of the battle would have far-reaching consequences for the entire continent. A French victory would likely have plunged Europe back into a state of war and upheaval, with Napoleon once again at the helm. A defeat for Napoleon, however, would shatter his dreams of empire and pave the way for a new European order. The stage was set for a titanic clash of arms, a day of destiny that would determine the future of Europe. The Battle of Waterloo was the culmination of events unfolding for over 2 decades. Napoleon's rise to power sent shockwaves through Europe. His military genius led to stunning victories across the continent. Napoleon's conquests redrew the map of Europe. However, his pursuit of power earned him many enemies. By 1814, a coalition defeated Napoleon, exiling him to Elba. His exile was short-lived. In February 1815, he escaped and returned to France. His return ignited popular support, raising a new army. His reappearance sent shockwaves through European courts. The coalition quickly reformed to prevent his return to power. Napoleon decided to take the offensive. He marched north, hoping to defeat the British and Prussian armies. This gamble led him to Waterloo. The Battle of Waterloo brought together 3 prominent military figures. On the French side stood Napoleon Bonaparte, a legend in his own time. Facing him was Arthur Wellesley, the Duke of Wellington. The third figure was Gebhard Liebrecht von Blücher, commander of the Prussian army. The clash between these titans would be one for the ages. The battlefield at Waterloo was dominated by a series of low ridges and rolling hills. The French army, positioned south of the village of Waterloo, faced north towards the Allied lines. Wellington had carefully chosen his position, anchoring his right flank on the chateau of Hougoumont and his left on the village of Papelotte. The main Allied line ran along a low ridge, giving them a slight advantage over the approaching French forces. Napoleon's plan was to break through the Allied center, splitting their forces and then destroying them in detail. The battle began in earnest around midday on June 18th, with a massive French artillery bombardment of the Allied positions. The earth shook as hundreds of French cannons unleashed a storm of iron upon the Allied lines. The bombardment was intended to soften up the Allied defenses and demoralize their troops. However, Wellington had anticipated the French tactic and had ordered his men to take cover behind the reverse slope of the ridge, minimizing the effects of the bombardment. The French artillery barrage, while impressive in its scale, failed to achieve its intended effect. The Allied troops, though shaken, remained resolute in their defensive positions. Section 5. The French Assault, Napoleon's Early Confidence. Following the artillery bombardment, Napoleon launched a series of infantry and cavalry attacks against the Allied lines. The first major French assault fell upon the chateau of Hougoumont, a strategically important outpost on the Allied right flank. The French believed that capturing Hougoumont would allow them to roll up the Allied line. However, the British defenders of Hougoumont, led by the staunch general Sir James Macdonell, put up a fierce resistance. Wave after wave of French attackers were repulsed with heavy losses. Despite the setback at Hougoumont, Napoleon remained confident of victory. He believed that his superior numbers and the fighting spirit of his troops would eventually overwhelm the Allied defenses. He ordered a series of massive cavalry charges against the Allied center, hoping to break through their lines. The French cavalry, renowned for their dash and élan, thundered towards the Allied positions. The ground trembled beneath the hooves of thousands of charging horses. The Allied infantry, formed into squares to repel the cavalry, braced themselves for the impact. Section 6. Holding the line, Wellington's stubborn defense. The Allied infantry, under intense pressure from the French assaults, held their ground with remarkable discipline and courage. Wellington, a master of defensive tactics, had drilled his men relentlessly in the art of repelling cavalry charges. The Allied squares, bristling with bayonets, presented an impenetrable wall of steel to the French cavalry. Time and again, the French cavalry hurled themselves against the Allied squares, only to be repulsed with heavy losses. The Allied artillery, skillfully deployed along the ridgeline, inflicted terrible casualties on the attacking French formations. As the afternoon wore on, the battlefield became a scene of unimaginable carnage. The ground was littered with the dead and wounded of both sides. Still, Wellington refused to yield. He rode among his men, rallying them with words of encouragement and praise. His calm demeanor and unwavering determination inspired his troops to fight with even greater tenacity. The Allied soldiers, exhausted and depleted, knew that the fate of Europe rested on their shoulders. They would hold their ground, no matter the cost. Section 7. The Prussians approach. A glimmer of hope for the Allies. As the day wore on and the battle raged, a glimmer of hope appeared on the horizon for the beleaguered Allied army. In the distance, the sound of cannon fire could be heard coming from the east. It was the sound of the Prussian army under the command of the indomitable Blücher arriving on the battlefield. Blücher, true to his word, had promised Wellington that he would come to his aid. Now, with the fate of the battle hanging in the balance, the Prussians were making their presence felt. The arrival of the Prussians was a critical turning point in the battle. Napoleon, realizing the danger posed by the Prussian advance, dispatched a portion of his forces to hold them off. However, the French troops sent to block the Prussian advance were too few in number. The Prussians, eager to avenge their earlier defeats at the hands of Napoleon, fought with fierce determination. They gradually pushed back the French, threatening Napoleon's right flank. Section 8. The tide turns. Blücher's arrival and the French retreat. With the arrival of the Prussians in force on their right flank, the tide of the battle began to turn decisively in favor of the Allies. Wellington, sensing that the moment had come to seize victory, ordered a general advance along the entire Allied line. The Allied troops, exhausted but reinvigorated by the sight of their Prussian allies, surged forward with renewed determination. The French, attacked on two sides and facing overwhelming odds, began to give ground. Their lines, which had held firm for so long, began to crumble. The retreat, once it began, quickly turned into a rout. Panic spread through the French ranks as they realized the hopelessness of their situation. Napoleon, his dreams of empire shattered, watched in dismay as his army dissolved around him. He had risked everything on this one last gamble, and he had lost. The once invincible emperor was forced to flee the battlefield, leaving behind him thousands of dead and wounded. Section 9. The Emperor's Demise. Napoleon's final defeat. The Battle of Waterloo marked the end of Napoleon's reign and the final chapter in his extraordinary career. After his defeat, Napoleon fled to Paris, hoping to rally support for his cause. However, the French people, weary of war and eager for peace, had abandoned their emperor. Napoleon was forced to abdicate for the second and final time on June 22, 1815. He surrendered to the British and was exiled to the remote island of St. Helena in the South Atlantic. Napoleon would spend the rest of his days on St. Helena, a prisoner of the British. He died there in 1821 at the age of 51. The defeat at Waterloo had shattered Napoleon's dreams of empire and brought an end to his reign over France. He would forever be remembered as one of the greatest military commanders in history. But his legacy would also be forever tarnished by his ambition and his inability to accept defeat. The world would never again see the likes of Napoleon Bonaparte. Section 10. The Legacy of Waterloo. A Europe Reshaped. The Battle of Waterloo was a watershed moment in European history. It marked the end of the Napoleonic Wars, a series of conflicts that had ravaged the continent for over 2 decades. The battle also ushered in a new era of peace and stability in Europe. With Napoleon gone, the great powers of Europe met at the Congress of Vienna to redraw the map of Europe and establish a new balance of power. The Congress of Vienna sought to prevent future conflicts by creating a system of collective security. The legacy of Waterloo extended far beyond the battlefield. The battle had a profound impact on military thinking, leading to the development of new tactics and strategies. It also captured the imagination of artists, writers, and musicians, inspiring countless works of art, literature, and music. The Battle of Waterloo remains one of the most famous battles in history, a symbol of courage, sacrifice, and the enduring struggle for freedom and liberty.